Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on whether you are in the world, wherever, good day. Welcome to this, the last in our series this year of Royal Institute of Philosophy London lectures, nominally London, but of course now truly international, thanks to the wonder of the interweb. Our theme has been a Philosophers' Manifesto. We've been asking leading philosophers from different parts of the world, different traditions, even different disciplines, actually. Not all of them have the word philosopher in their job title, to presenters with a proposition for a policy or some kind of program and give the philosophical case for it. And the last one this evening is going to be presented by Debra Satz, who's going to be arguing for a form of national service. And as someone who grew up in a time where no such thing was obligatory, I find myself both fascinated and somewhat resistant to this idea. But I think you'll agree with me that whether you ultimately agree or not, it's a very persuasive case we're going to hear. Debra Satz is the Martha Sutton Weeks Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University and the author of books and articles which consider the nature and consequences of inequality, including economic analysis and why some things should not be for sale, the moral limits of markets. One of the interesting initiatives she's actually done is to co-found a program where Stanford faculty teach humanities classes to women just released from prisons. So if you're familiar with the format here, we're going to just hear the talk to begin with. It'll be about half an hour. And then we'll go into a discussion. And that discussion will have plenty of questions from me, but hopefully plenty of questions from you too. You can enter the questions into the chat, whether you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube. Quick hint, particularly for YouTube, try and keep your questions sharp and crisp and within the character limit for one comment. And then we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. But let's begin by hearing Debra's talk.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me, and I'm pleased to be here. And I'm going to be making an argument today for mandatory public service as a requirement for all democratic societies. So let me start by noting that democratic citizenship is an achievement. Citizenship in democracies is the most powerful way we have to integrate the demands of justice with membership in a community. The idea links a commitment to free and equal individuals with differing ways of life, religion, and identities, but who share the same fundamental status, the status of a citizen, to the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation. Democratic citizenship sharply breaks, at least in its aspirations and its commitments, with older ways of organizing societies on the basis of natural hierarchies, social caste, privilege, dictatorship, and minority rule. This achievement is under a great deal of stress right now, as should be obvious to anybody looking at the news. Public confidence in democracy is at the lowest point on record in the United States, the major democracies of Western Europe, in sub-Saharan Africa, and in Latin America. In some countries, including the United States, this metric has now reached a critical threshold. The number of people who are dissatisfied with democracy is greater than the number of people who are satisfied with it. So I want to introduce an argument for national service by first reflecting on how we got here and a bit of the history of democratic citizenship. And I'm going to turn to the sociologist T.H. Marshall, who in his classic work on citizenship, called Citizenship and Social Class, described the path to modern citizenship in terms of 3 stages. Each stage is correlated with an expansion in the rights that individuals hold till we get to the modern world. So from the 17th to the mid-18th century, we see a consolidation of the civil rights needed to engage in a range of activities, including rights to practice your religion and to engage in trade and to own property. From the late 18th to the early 20th century, citizenship evolved to include political rights, such as the right to vote and the right to stand for an election. And finally, in World War II and its aftermath, democracies created social and economic rights to give citizens a right to, as Marshall put it, share in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in society. Modern citizenship, then, is meant to include all three sets of rights: civil rights, political rights, and economic rights. Where any of these rights are violated or ascribed unequally, some people are excluded from full membership in society. And Marshall was particularly concerned to integrate the working class, whose lack of education and economic resources had excluded them from the common culture, which he believed should be the, quote, common possession and heritage, quote, of all members of a society. Now, the arc of creating these rights owes a great deal to generations of activists, to labor unions, and to social movements, although we know this process is still underway as these rights are imperfectly realized in many societies. But still, there's been a marked improvement and expansion in the rights of citizens. Now, you might think as the rights of citizenship expanded, the obligations associated with citizenship would also expand. And that's because, in general, rights are correlated with obligations. It doesn't make sense to say I have a right to something if there's no obligation, no duty on anybody to provide me with that something or to enforce my having that something when other people try to take it away from me. Rights without corresponding duties or obligations, while not nothing, run the risk of being mere words. And that's sometimes a charge that's leveled against human rights. Marshall himself saw this reciprocal relationship between rights and responsibilities, writing, quote, "If citizenship is invoked in the defense of rights, the corresponding duties of citizenship cannot be ignored." Okay, but the obligations of citizenship have steadily eroded over time, even as citizens' rights have grown. Today, for the most part, the obligations of citizens are understood as aspirations and not requirements. So, for example, it's sometimes said that a good citizen is someone who votes, pays their taxes, obeys the laws, and otherwise participates in the collective process of self-government. But a sizable proportion of citizens in democracies never or rarely vote and play little role in collective decision-making at any level. And you can see that there's been a decline in participation with a bit of a spike up around the Brexit vote. What about the obligation to pay taxes? Taxation, like obeying the law, isn't so much a feature of citizenship, but of residency. In the United States, everybody who physically lives and works within its boundaries is required to pay taxes and obey the law. For much of American history, serving in the military was seen as a core obligation of citizenship, although of course only for men, at least initially. In 1973, that changed when the draft was abolished and an all-volunteer military force was established. Britain abolished its own system of conscription in 1960. Now, many well-known factors led to the ending of the draft in the United States, including an unpopular war, the war in Vietnam. What's less known is the fact that the libertarian economist Milton Friedman played a significant role in ending the draft. Friedman and his followers successfully argued to President Richard Nixon that the draft was equivalent of indentured servitude. Friedman denied, obviously, then, that service was an obligation. The result is that in many democracies, military service has become voluntary, a market-allocated phenomenon, yielding a smaller and more focused group of people who serve. Fewer than 1% of the United States population today serves in the military. In fact, the only obligation that American citizens currently have as citizens is the obligation to serve on a jury. But that's a weak requirement, occurring very sporadically, if at all. So the upshot of this is that in the 21st century, the obligations of citizenship are, for the most part, an empty set. And my aim now is to convince you that this empty set poses a problem, propose a policy in response to that problem, and then try to anticipate some objections. So what's the problem? I guess the one way of putting it is that citizenship can't be maintained by laws and incentives alone, that the existence of a healthy and stable democracy depends in some way on the quality and attitudes of society's members. While it's sometimes said that good incentives, whether economic incentives or the threat of punishment, can make self-interested individuals into good citizens, to quote the 17th century philosopher Bernard Manville, private vices can yield public benefits. We know today that in many cases, self-interested motives are not sufficient to produce publicly oriented behaviors. So just here's a pretty well-known example. In Haifa, 6 daycare centers imposed a fine on parents who came late to pick up their children at the end of the day. And I'm sure many of you can relate to this, not an uncommon experience. Parents, so the daycares put a fine. They imposed a fine on parents who came late. And parents responded to this in a surprising way. They doubled the amount of time that they were late. Even when after 12 weeks the fines were revoked, the parents' sense of tardiness persisted. Putting a price on lateness undermined the parents' sense of an ethical obligation to avoid inconveniencing the teachers. Instead, time was now a commodity that could be bought. And this shows you parents were somewhat late before the fine. The fine is terminated, and the parents stay late. It doesn't go back down to its pre-fine levels. Now, this finding is sometimes known as the crowding out effect, that market incentives can sometimes crowd out pro-social attitudes like concern for others. And that finding has been repeated in a great many studies. In fact, there are even studies showing that merely studying economics decreases a student's ability to solve certain kinds of collective action problems, precisely because it undermines other directed motivations. What about legal incentives, like the threat of punishment for breaking the law? Isn't that enough to generate the pro-social behaviors you need to maintain a democracy? Not by itself. One problem is that pro-social motivation isn't going to be sustained in cases where many people are breaking the laws. So if lots of people are breaking laws and getting away with it, I don't want to be a sucker, so I'm not going to follow the rules. Another problem is it's often costly to ascertain whether people are breaking the rules or not. You don't want to live in a surveillance state. And finally, and this is the key problem, it's hard to sustain the motivation to follow the laws in a society that's cleaved along racial, ethnic, or class lines, where people's unequal circumstances and limited knowledge about one another undermine the existence of a democratic we. Under these circumstances, it's easy for me to see your fate as outside my responsibility and to bend the rules to favor myself over you. And here's an interesting cultural flashpoint. The use of the term responsibility in American publications has declined with respect to the use of the term rights over the last 50 years. This is a finding from a recent book by Robert Putnam and a co-author. So my point here is that markets and laws are not sufficient for pro-social motivation and behavior. And democratic societies require a special kind of pro-social motivation, the motivation to endorse and to comply with political and social rules that promote the common good, even in cases where you might be better off by subverting the rules or going around them. Members of society need to see each other as passengers on the same ship. And it's hard to build a cooperative ethos when, to continue with my metaphor, the rich members of society can sail away on their yachts. In fact, the tendency of elites to lose touch with the rest of society has been widely observed. One can see the underlying pathology on display in the wake of the Occupy movement when a spate of articles began to appear written by members of the top 1%, explaining they weren't all that rich, given the price of private schools, second homes, yoga classes, and vacations. It's easy to endorse policies that one's privilege can make one immune to. And the ability of the wealthy to exit from the effects of a policy can weaken the bargaining power and the voice of those who remain. This is a familiar observation about the interactions of what Albert Hirschman called exit and voice. So when the rich can exit to private schools, private planes, private modes of transportation, they have little interest in helping and using law to provide these for others. My point here is that a democratic society requires certain experiences where everyone is on an equal footing and everyone is treated the same. You can think of standing in line to vote or to get a driver's license. Some people have called these situations points of forced solidarity. Among other things, they serve as a check on the tendency of the ultra-rich to drift off into their own little world and to insulate themselves from the hardships and life of an ordinary person. These points of forced solidarity put us, at least for a time, in the same boat. And in today's American society, few, if any, of these points of forced solidarity remain. It's here, first and foremost, that an argument for universal national service arises. There are few institutions, at least in the United States, I suspect also in Britain, that bring individuals together across their differences in contexts where they can relate to each other as equals. In the United States, schools and neighborhoods are deeply segregated by race and class. White nationalism is on the rise. Rural communities don't interact with urban ones. Workplaces are hierarchically organized, and the lives of CEOs and managers are more isolated and different than ever from their employees. There are separate lines at airports, private and public schools. In the United States, there are even public roads with faster traffic lanes that are available for the price of a fee. The rules of the game have been tilted to favor elites, and the idea that we're all in this together has a hollow ring, as actually the results, looking at the results of the COVID pandemic have shown in really underscored. So a carefully constructed national service program can respond to these problems. It can bring citizens together across their differences by mixing service groups across race, class, and geographical divisions. Decades ago, the social psychologist Gordon Alpert showed that racial and other prejudices flourish in ignorance, but that close interracial contact reduces stereotyping and hostility if the contact is of a type that leads people to do things together. Alpert also argued that the effects of such contact are greatly enhanced if sanctioned by institutional supports. Alpert's hypothesis is one of the most widely tested claims in social psychology, and it is held up under meta-analyses of hundreds of studies and applied to numerous group divisions. My proposal to establish a mandatory year of national service for citizens between the ages of 18 and 25, with an exemption only for those doing military service, is an instance of a forced solidarity point. The program would involve participants in the creation of public goods, whether the maintenance of roads, work on infrastructure projects, work in education, helping the elderly, or other kinds of public projects like public art. Rigorous studies have shown that volunteer service groups, from the Depression to the Great Society programs in the US, the Peace Corps and VISTA, have provided young people with individual benefits in work skills, in setting directions. The voluntary service programs that we have today have stunningly high approval rates from their alumni. 94% say they gained a better understanding of different communities, and 80% say that the program helped their careers. A lot of proposals are being offered these days for national service, drawing on this data, but none of them advocate mandatory service. Now, there are reasons for that caution, which I'll discuss below in a moment, but allowing exit would weaken my argument for this program, which turns on a different public benefit. The programs can't deliver the desired cultural effects if select groups, like the wealthy and privileged, or the very, very poor, can opt out, and if service opportunities are unequally distributed. It's by helping to dismantle racial, socioeconomic, and geographical barriers between people that national service creates its most important public good, the relationships and understandings among the participants themselves that can engender a sense of citizens' solidarity. An integrated military draft once played this role. And even before the military was racially integrated in the United States, it did mix up people by social class. Just think of John F. Kennedy's famous PT boat in World War II. Kennedy was the son of one of the richest men in America, but on his boat, in the same boat, were the sons of a farmer, a plumber, an artist, and an auto mechanic. Now, I can go on with some of the details of how I would structure this program, but I want to turn instead, so we have time for a discussion, to two obvious objections to this proposal. I already alluded to one, the fact that it's mandatory. After all, if the idea of citizenship is that people are free and equal, how are we respecting the free and equal nature of each individual if we can force them to spend a year serving public programs? Obviously, Milton Friedman argued that compulsory military service is bondage, and that argument resonates with many people. So it should be obvious that I reject the analogy between a service obligation and servitude, but it's important to see the nature of the argument I'm making. I'm not arguing for national service because I think it's good for people to engage in this service, So for paternalist reasons, although I do think that, but I'm not arguing on grounds of paternalist or moralist reasons. I'm not saying it's good for your soul to be a generous person. Rather, I'm arguing on the hypothesis that the lack of a common experience tackling problems together is undermining democracy, that we have an obligation as citizens to do our part in upholding democracy. If you're committed to the end, if you're committed to democracy, you've got to be committed here to the means of maintaining democracy. So that's my response to the first objection. There's more to say about that. A second objection is that this kind of proposal treats only the symptoms and not the causes. The reason, a critic might argue, that there's decline in support for democracy is democracy really hasn't been delivering many benefits to ordinary citizens over the past 5 decades. Racial and class barriers and a lack of faith in the political system are the result of this inequality. Why not simply use the tax system to generate more equality of condition? So there are 3 reasons why I would start with national service. The first 2 are pragmatic. You're unlikely to get substantial changes to the tax system or to exclusionary zoning regulations, which keep poor people out of many areas, without greater solidarity among citizens. In addition, the most successful innovations in American society, from public schools, benefits to Civil War veterans, Social Security, and the GI Bill of Rights in 1944, were all based on the idea of social support in response to service. Benefits connected to obligations. Goes back to the point I made about incentives. Without some degree of solidarity, egalitarian policies are difficult to maintain. And solidarity and trust depend on certain conditions, that reciprocity is not being violated, that free riders are held to account, and that relevant information is shared, which is difficult to maintain in large impersonal market societies. Markets encourage segmentation and differentiation, which is a great plus when you're buying food for yourself, but not when you're trying to shore up a democratic society. And I'll stop on that note. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deborah. We've already got some questions coming in. Please do keep adding them into the relevant comment box, depending on whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook. I will come to some of those questions soon. I've got quite a few on my own too. So let's have a look. So Deborah, first of all, let's start off. Let's go right back to the beginning, actually. And you were talking about the idea of democratic citizenship and really sort of celebrating it as a kind of achievement. And I was just wondering, to what extent do you think it's true that part of the problem is that the way in which we've come to understand democracy has kind of really divorced it from the idea of citizenship? And what I mean is this, that philosophers know that people like Plato and Aristotle were very, very down on democracy. And the reason why they were down on it was that they thought democracy would be a kind of a majoritarian populism, right? People demanding, this is what I want, and you give it to me. So it becomes almost like a kind of market transaction in a sense. You know, you get the government that you vote for, and then they do what you want. And it's sort of like supply and demand kind of thinking. And that kind of version of democracy doesn't really involve any idea of citizenship, does it? And I wonder in other respects too, with, we think about freedom and liberty. So this is a very slightly rambling question maybe, but I'm wondering whether or not in the popular imagination, the idea of democracy and freedom has precisely become a notion in which your individual autonomy is sacrosanct. And the citizenship, which is about belonging to the state, has almost become the antithesis of it, because that is about obligation and belonging. So is this really a deep-rooted shift in attitudes which is the source of the problem?
I do think there's been a shift in attitudes, and in some ways, the the chart I put up from Putnam's recent book, the Big Swing, gets at that, which is I do think people have become very skeptical of the fact that together we can do good things and we come together to do good things. And that's why we have societies and political organization, and that many people think governments only do bad things and we should just get them minimize their role in our lives and we'll all be better off. And of course, that's not something people reflect on that deeply, because when they reflect on that more deeply, they'll have to see there are a lot of great things that governments have done and are doing for them. Like the Monty Python episode where I think it's in The Life of Brian, one of the characters says, "What have the Romans ever done for us? We're oppressed." And the person says, "Well, what about the roads?" And then the guy says, "Well, okay, besides the roads. Well, what about the irrigation and water system? All right, besides that." So I think, governments have done a lot of things. They've also, been inefficient and not done as well. And there are obviously lots of challenges, but I do think the idea for many people that together we can do good things has been called into question.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm going to take some questions from the audience straight away because I've already got quite a few coming in. Before that, just a comment really by Charles Conway. He's just noted, "My service in the Marine Corps has rendered lifetime benefits, and I've urged a National Service Corps for 50 years for just the reasons Professor Satz notes." And I think a lot of people who did do national service when it was still obligatory do say things like that. But here's a question, and this one comes from someone who signs off as Kate S. And she says the poor won't be able to afford this. It will always disproportionately affect the poor who could be using that year in work earning money. There's another point she made in a separate question, which was, apart from the fact that the poor won't be able to afford it, there's the idea that one way or another, the rich will be able to opt out. So she says the last time national service was imposed, the rich paid doctors to sign them off it. They will always find a way to use their money and influence to dodge drafts. And actually somebody else who describes themselves as the cyber socialist said, how can you stop rich people buying exemption? One way, for example, by buying alternative nationality. So there were two different points there. There's about the inclusivity so one way or another, both these are ways of saying that actually, you know what, the rich are going to opt out and the poor, it will be a burden.
So great questions. Let me take them in order. On the point about the poor not being able to afford this, so I think there are two things to say about that. I think this is a program that you should be paid during that year. And the various proposals to how to structure that payment, but because it's a service doesn't mean you shouldn't get paid for doing it. You should get some kind of payment, and you should get skill development, which is what we've found with voluntary service for participants. And many of the voluntary service programs in the United States have been oriented to poor residents, poor citizens, and they have developed skills. The GI World War II was a wonderful example of that. And don't forget, coming out of World War II, we had a GI Bill with free education to people who'd served in the military. And we should also be thinking about benefits for people who've done their national service. There were investment. It's not only is this I think creating some individual benefits, but it's creating social benefits, and we should be grateful, right, for everybody doing their part here to maintain society. So I think there are ways to structure this. Another possibility would be some people have talked about a basic income grant that would be given to all individuals at the age of 18. That's a proposal that's been associated with Bruce Ackerman in the United States. You could condition that on having done national service, would be another way of giving a benefit. So I think there are ways to handle this is too costly poor. On how do you close off exit of the rich? That's a great question. As we do know that even the draft, there were various ways for wealthier people to get out of the draft. I think you do what you can. We also will need a cultural campaign to stigmatize people who didn't participate in this but could have. Obviously, there are going to be some people who probably can't participate in for various reasons, but wealth is not a reason why you couldn't participate in this. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Now, your connection has been a little bit breaking up in the last sort of few minutes. It's okay at the moment. We've caught everything. If it gets worse, what we might have to do is just ask you to reconnect another way. But let's persist for the moment because I think it's good enough. Great questions. Just a little follow-up on that, though. Whenever people propose anything in public policy, which is, a significant change, people are very keen to point out the drawbacks and the problems. But do you think there's a kind of unfair burden of proof? Because if you like, the problems with the status quo, I mean, it's not like the status quo doesn't have big problems, right? But we kind of tolerate them because we just think they're the problems you have to have in the status quo. Is the imperfections of a new system often used to be devastating. I found this, my personal view, speaking personally, I have to say, not the view of the institution. We had a referendum on electoral reform in the UK a few years ago, a more proportional system. And it seemed to me that people were very hung up on the imperfections of what was being proposed, when the imperfections of what we already had were so much greater. So, I mean, do you sometimes feel there's an unfair burden of proof on reformers?
Yes. You're feeding me the answer here, but yes, I do. Whenever you're thinking about a policy, you have to think about the space of alternatives, right? So a policy has to be defeated by that there's a better policy. I think right now, democratic political systems, social systems are in trouble. They're in trouble in the United States. They're in trouble in Western Europe. There is a real serious question about the long-term stability of democratic societies. And there are a lot of people within those societies no longer committed to the idea that we're in this together. And they are trying to use political power to exclude some members of their societies from, having their say. And that is a very dangerous place to be. So I do think in thinking about this, you want to think about, well, if not this, then what? What would be alternatives? Obviously, one alternative to a mandatory service requirement is simply to make it voluntary. And there the question would be, would you get the right mix of people if you did that? And, of course, we don't fully know that. But I would speculate that you would not get the right mix of people. And you would not have the ability really to mix people up, which is, I think, for me, the public benefit that national service produces is not so much better roads, although it hopefully would produce better infrastructure and better roads, but different kind of people who know something about each other, care about each other, and have lived together and worked together and solved problems together for a year, and made friendships and relationships that make it harder for them to think these people don't really deserve to have a say.
Great. If you ask a question, I am coming to you, believe me, but you keep raising things which I think, well, I want to just pick up on things before we move on. One thing to say there about the solidarity thing, it is interesting. In the UK, I'm based in the UK, and our most sort of valued public institution is the National Health Service. And I suspect it's no coincidence, because that is the one thing that almost everyone uses. Even the rich use the National Health Service. They may opt out for certain elective surgeries, but they use it for most of their daily care. So that's quite interesting. But this idea that people are losing faith in the idea that we're all in it together. I mean, the cynical view is that they're losing faith because it was never true, and people are simply realizing that now, right? So how would you react to that skeptical response?
So, yes, there is a lot of that's the objection I was imagining from the person who says, look, the problem is democracy is not delivering. The rich are, taking more than their share. If people were together and thinking that, maybe that would and had identified that as the problem. But I think because then if they thought that and they thought that was wrong, they might be organizing to do something about that. And some people are, but many people are not. In fact, largely people are not organizing to do something about that. Instead, and rather than turning, to criticize the wealthy, a lot of the populist movements are simply criticizing those who are different, whether different ethnicity, immigrants, people who are now stigmatized as outsiders, even if they're long-term members of the community. There isn't a sense that people are especially attuned to the fact that there are a small minority of people who've been reaping all the benefits, and we have to get together because we're a majority and stop that.
You've actually queued up nicely an audience question from Maxwell Reese, and he has a concern. He says, can promoting citizenship increase national parochialism to the detriment of, it says cornersmen, I think it's corners, probably a typo. Perhaps one cause of fascism is a zealous enthusiasm for one's duties. So, and this is this a version of a general dilemma, isn't it? That increasing national solidarity risks creating an exclusionary anti-foreigner solidarity.
Yes, I think that's a good point, and there obviously is some danger there. On the other hand, we don't have a way at the moment of organizing solidarities that are strong enough across national borders. There's a weaker kind of solidarity that's possible across national borders, but we don't share institutions to the extent that we share institutions within nation states. I do want to say I don't think of this as a nationalist solidarity. I think of it as a civic solidarity, because it's not based so much on ethnicity, so it's not ethno-nationalism. It's a loyalty to the set of institutions that make one's freedom and equality possible. That doesn't relieve us of obligations to outsiders, but I am somebody who thinks our obligations to our fellow citizens are different than our obligations to strangers. to others. Not to say that we don't have very important obligations to outsiders, but they're not the same obligations. I don't think the differences in, let's say, life expectancy between white and Black Americans should be viewed the same as the differences in life expectancy between Americans and people in other countries. And that's because our institutions in the United States are responsible for the unequal life expectancies of white and Black Americans. They are not as directly responsible for the fact that in some countries there are much lower life expectancies, probably in part due to civil wars.
That's great. I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting about that kind of whether it involves a kind of the less savoury kind of patriotism. And I think we do have models, don't we? I think of in certain nations there's a kind of, I think something called a civic patriotism, which is nothing to do with ethnicity or blood. I think Canada is often said to have more this idea of civic nationalism, that you become a Canadian citizen and you're no matter where you've come from, you're immediately as Canadian as anybody else. And I know the Scottish Nationalist Party in the last referendum on independence, very much its official line was very much about the idea of civic nationalism and not any kind of ethnic one. So I guess there are different models there. Another question that we've got here by Ringe Bill is the name. It says the great thing about the internet is that people give themselves all sorts of weird names, and this is his name. Why is mandatory service a better way of producing a forced point of solidarity than mandatory comprehensive public education? I mean, I think this is particularly an issue in the United Kingdom. I think we've had quite a large public school sector for some time. And it divides children at quite a young age, and a lot of people think it's a problem. Some people think it's just untouchable, and other people think it's a real source of problems. Would this not be most effective if kids are forced to be together until aged 18? Won't that do a lot to address the kind of solidarity issues that you're concerned about?
Great question. So I have a couple of responses to it. I mean, the idea of public education in the United States in its origins was a common education, common for all citizens. There are a couple of problems with that model at this point. One is that our neighborhoods, our cities, our states are incredibly segregated. So unless you move people around, it's very difficult to get a mixture within a community of a diverse population. In fact, over the last 25 years, the United States' public schools have become more segregated, and that's in part because neighborhoods and areas of the country have become more segregated. So that's one dilemma of trying to use the schools. We did try some limits to have a busing program that tried to move kids. Here, the rich absolutely exited and moved to suburbs that were too far away for the busing and weren't included in the busing plans. So one dilemma is the lack of a mix in the way we live. And I suspect that's also true in Britain, but I'd be interested in knowing more. The second problem is unique to the United States, and that is there's constitutional problems with trying to abolish private schools in the United States. So much as I might think would be a good thing if we didn't have private schools available, there's a constitutional impediment to doing anything about that. So mandatory national service doesn't come up against those barriers, both because you can move people around the country, you can set things up to create the micro diversity in the different groups that you're seeking, and there's no constitutional prohibition on it.
Now, that is interesting because in the United Kingdom, it is true that not only do we have the opt-out of people paying for private schools, we also have a different kind of segregation whereby essentially people move into the catchment areas of schools. And this is a huge thing in the UK. Property prices are hugely influenced by whether or not a property is in a catchment area of what is seen as a desirable school. So we get kind of social segregation. People in a sense, they are buying an education for their children, but not by school fees, by paying a premium on their property. But I was wondering whether or not that would also be a problem for this public service thing you've got, because I imagined that as opposed to military service, in military service, everyone just goes off to barracks. There's genuine mixing. You would have thought perhaps with the public service kind of thing, that it would probably be more likely to be in your local neighborhood and area, and that might replicate those divisions. But I think from what you just said there, you are suggesting that this program has to be designed in such a way that you are physically moving people from their doorsteps, right?
Yeah, it has to be more, mimicking some of what you got with military service, which was throwing lots of different people together. And I think one of the important divides in the United States, and I suspect also in Britain, is between rural and urban populations. And we really, if you live in a city, you really have very, very little understanding or knowledge about rural communities, a lot of stereotypes, and also the reverse. And that is an impediment to our being able to work and solve problems together. So yes, I would design this in such a way that there was a lot of moving around.
Okay. A small apology, first of all. I knew as I was saying it, I was probably making a faux pas with Ring Bill. It is, of course, because it's his actual name, just the surnames come first. It's Bill Ring, which doesn't sound as half as strange as Ring Bill, does it? So apologies, Bill, if I was at all offensive in that. We've got a question here, which is quite interesting, from Alexander Vladimirov. What geographical scale is this best implemented at? We experience our cities and neighborhoods, but have to often follow rules from nations that are more detached from everyday experience. So I guess in the US context, is this going to be a federal thing, or is it going to be a state level thing? And I guess if we're thinking about this as an idea that is also possible to do in other nations and other countries too. From what you were saying, it sounded like perhaps you thought this needed to sort of be done almost at a federal level. I don't know, but the question suggests people are suspicious of that.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, so I take the questioner's point. Ideally, this would be done at a more local level, like within a state. But I actually think some of the divisions will push you to have to move to the federal level. We have, there's in the United States, there are such important differences between the situations of people in different states, whether you're in New York State or in Montana or in Georgia. And I think a benefit for the United States of this program would have to be mixing people across those individual lines. And so it would have to be a federal program. Again, that's thinking also about the analogy with military service, which was a national program, not a state-by-state program.
In terms of one thing that struck me when you were talking was you said there was an exemption for military service. So if you're already doing military service, you wouldn't do this. I was curious as to why you might also not get an exemption if you've already chosen a public service career path.
Mm-hmm. So remember that this is meant really for, let's say, 18-year-olds. They may not have chosen a public career yet. Yeah. And again, a public career path it might be great for you and great that you're, other directed, but it doesn't produce the benefit for society that I'm looking for, which really is to, change the bonds and ties between individuals who are very different. Uh, we have a lot of differences. It's one of the great strengths of the modern world is we bring people into cooperation with us who don't have to share our religion, our ethnicity, our race, our conceptions of the good, but it's hard. It's hard work across those differences. And we need some things that kind of put us together and bring us back together with a sense of we can do these things together. And we can't do things together if we don't trust each other, don't relate to one another, and allow everybody to go their own way, regardless of the implications. Particularly for those who are least well off.
Thanks, Rich. I'm getting a little bit of breakup again, but perhaps we're getting towards the sort of final straight of the session anyway. So I think we'll push on through. This is a question from Flower Dong, which is about some of the more practicalities really. What will be the scope of choice for choosing the kind of work they can do? Is there going to be any choice at all, or are you just going to be allocated something? And what's the rationale for the decision as to which way it goes?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer to that. I could imagine it being done in such a way that if you had some interest in being involved in education, you could sign up, you list your order of preferences, and then as you're allocated, people try to get you your top preference the same way, we allocate dorm rooms in a university. We try to, here are my preferences in order. We're also trying to mix, the dorms up in various ways. And so you might not get your first preference because we're trying to create a certain kind of learning environment. So, you could try to balance the different views. It probably would be better to allow people some choice over what they might do. Although some people may not have any choice, they might be willing to do whatever they were assigned to do.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting one, that, because I think that when you bring in the element of choice, then it is extraordinary how easily that leads to a kind of a self-segregation, even unwittingly. I was very struck when I went to university. We had halls of residences, as we call them, the dorms. And I had no idea what I was applying to or whatever it was. But when I got to university, it became very clear that there was one in particular which was very, very much more sort of like moneyed than the rest. They'd all congregated there for some reason. There were all sorts of strange factors involved as to why people choose one thing or another. And maybe it'll be the same with the tasks. But let's just a few other things I'd like to talk about. Going back to this thing about the problem of rich exit, yeah. And this is a big problem for society. It would be a problem for this, but to what extent is the ability of the rich to exit now too deeply baked into the global system? Is this a genie we can put back into the bottle? I mean, basically, the rich can up and go wherever the world. Tax residency is now, almost more important than citizenship. Actually, you're a citizen of the world and you're a tax resident of somewhere. Is this a fight we can't really win anymore because we live in such a globalized world? The rich are going to find their way out.
That might be. I mean, it's definitely globalization puts some limits on egalitarianism within countries. I wouldn't want to overexaggerate those limits. Countries differ a great deal in the degree of equality that they're able to maintain, even in a globalized world. So I think there would be some exit. Lots of people want to stay in their home country. And, there are still too many barriers to leaving. So, but if all the rich left, maybe that wouldn't be such a problem if they left the country. The problem is they leave the country. They stay in the country and shape the laws of the country in ways that disproportionately benefit them. It's if the rich were only spending money on their yachts, that would be less of a problem than that they're spending it on influencing the political system and the economic system.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You made me think about something here, which has just escaped my mind. So I'll come back to it if I can. We don't normally like to allow people to ask two questions, but because of what I said about his name, we're going to allow Bill Ring a second question as by means of apology. He says, you might think that what generates solidarity is shared unpleasant experience. How unpleasant do you think this will have to be to work? Is it being a bit of a chore part of the deal?
I've thought about this because I have thought a lot about the ways, if you read memoirs of people who've fought in wars, it's clear that what very, very hard conditions, very, very stressful conditions, generated a lot of bonding between people. You don't want to have to put people through the worst kinds of conditions to get that bonding. But it is definitely true that sometimes being in a really hard situation with other people and having to depend on each other to get through it is a great purveyor of solidarity. I don't think it's the only purveyor of solidarity. I do think tackling problems and challenges that are not so unpleasant can also generate solidarities. That's certainly been the experience of people in the labor movement. Some of it, of course, was very hard conditions generating solidarity. Some of it was coming together and exercising agency. That can also be a tremendous, we did it, a creator of solidarities. So, but it's a good question. It's a good point. And as I say, I'm drawing a lot from the ways that military service, particularly in some of the world wars, did create this sense of we are in it together. And we did get a lot of national programs in the United States coming out of World War II that, although not perfect, exclusionary, particularly racially exclusionary, try to extend more rights, benefits to all citizens.
Okay, I'm not sure this is a question or just a thought to come back on, and I may not be able to articulate it properly. So let's give it a go. Something you said previously about how actually, people do, they don't necessarily want to leave their countries. They have an attachment to them, and so rich flight is perhaps something we should worry about too much. But I was thinking about this because of two particular examples I can give of this. First of all, around a lot of refugees. Most refugees, it seems, when you speak to them, what they want to do is return to their countries as soon as they're safe. They love their country, so they don't want to sort of go just because things are a better material quality of life. And similarly, in the UK, we had this issue around the expansion of the European Union when we were still members. And there was one particularly well-known, you may be able to guess who it is, pro-Brexit politician, who was sent by a television crew to, I think it was Romania, to try and and he was talking to people all the time, and he couldn't find a single person who was dying to get to the UK. People were saying they wanted to stay and build their country, they love their country, etc., etc. So it seems that on the one hand, it's actually true that people are not, on the whole, you know, so detached and so in pursuit of their own economic self-interest that they'll give up those ties of land and family. But, and here's the but, it seems that the more wealthy you become, and perhaps what you said, the more detached you do become. And so there's this jibe often put about the so-called citizens of nowhere and so forth. So I guess I'm not sure this is a question as such or just something to think about, but is part of the problem of solidarity that wealth and the freedom that provides kind of has almost seems to necessarily, or on average at least, create less of a sense of belonging. You know, wealth and opportunity is it like is the breaker of roots.
Mm-hmm. You know, I don't know if it has to be, but I do think it's a problem in our world. Um, the reasons I don't think it has to be is because you can have a group, you know, that has relative wealth, but is a consumer of public programs and public goods like everybody else. And you know, there are societies that have more of these points of what I refer to as forced solidarity. You know, you mentioned the National Health Service. That's also true in some of the Scandinavian countries and in Canada. The more those experiences exist where you are on the same footing with other people despite your wealth, I think the less it's a problem about feeling a lack of attachment. The more you can exit from everything, what does it really matter what the society is able to provide if you're able to provide it on your own? And that is a problem with us thinking about the funding of public schools. You know, one of the things we found in the United States is in communities that can raise their own funds for schools, often through having a tax shelter connected to the school, support for public funding of schools goes down because they can provide it on their own. So why should they also be paying taxes for schools? So I think that's the problem. Not so much that people have more, but that they don't feel like they're getting much benefit or need to get much benefit from a level of public services.
Okay, just to pass a final question, then, which is perhaps more of a general one. Several years ago, if you were studying political philosophy at a university or something, then you would be, you know, one of the things you'd be looking at would be the divisions between the libertarians, the classical liberals, and the communitarians. You know, these were kind of the typical kind of divisions that people looked at. And I wonder, this is a big picture question, how much do you think that people who belong to the camp, which we broadly called liberal, they're in favour of, you know, individual liberty, etc., have sort of, you know, in some ways perhaps accepted some of that communitarian critique? In other words, accepted the fact that the individualism, emphasis on individual rights in our society has actually created serious problems that need to be addressed. Do you think liberalism has changed? Should it change? Need it change even more?
So that's, you know, there are many, as you know, there are many varieties of liberalism. And, you know, I do think the communitarians were onto something, and that is, again, this idea about solidarity isn't typically seen as a liberal value. On the other hand, if you take somebody like the philosopher John Rawls as a paradigm case of a kind of liberal egalitarian, Rawls thought the union of social unions was what, you know, one of the virtues of a good society, that we would see in each other, right? And look at each other as members of this wonderful, beautiful, cooperative venture that, you know, is an amazing thing that we were able to create, and we would take pleasure in the excellences and virtues and the tapestry of this diverse society knit together in this way. So there are so many varieties of liberalism. I don't think all of the varieties of liberalism were as individualistic. I don't think Rawls's version was particularly individualistic, for example. I do think, libertarians and libertarianism, have to grapple with this problem of, that the rules of the game might fall apart, which they're dependent on too, even if they're different rules of the game. And that economic incentives and legal incentives aren't really sufficient to have stability over time of what you think of as the fair rules of the game.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much indeed. Deborah, your talk was so sort of tight and taut and well put together. You left us plenty of time for discussion, and we've had a good length of it. And as we know, it's been statistically proven that online seminars are 32.3% more tiring than ones in the flesh. So I think it's probably a good time to wind down. So this is the last in the current series. Sort of. We've had to postpone 2 talks. They will be rescheduled for some time. We don't know when yet. Keep an eye on our social media channels. Look at our subscribe to our YouTube channel or our Facebook page, or you can subscribe to the newsletter at the Royal Institute of Philosophy website. There will be more to come. Of course, the entire series is available to see on YouTube along with other events. Our new series, the theme yet to be announced, but believe me, work's underway putting it together, will start again in the autumn. And we'll be organising other events throughout the year too. We have annual lectures in London, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Dublin. And we'll also be having our annual debate. Thank you very much for joining us, but thank you. And thank you also, by the way, behind the scenes in this series has been Matt Titterton. He's been handling the tech, which, as we know, is often very challenging. It's all gone pretty well, so thanks to him. And of course, most of all, thank you very much to Professor Debra Satz for a really interesting talk and a really engaged discussion.